Welcome back, London Reelers. It's been a crazy week here in the studio. We've just dropped the Nick Gabriel ayahuasca episode last week, and the feedback has been tremendous. We've had messages from people all over the world that really identified with Nick's very personal and very emotional description of his time down in the jungles of Peru. If you haven't watched or listened to it, you must check it out. We called it Ayahuasca, My Heart of Darkness. You can catch that on iTunes or YouTube. Some people are saying it's the best account they've ever heard of someone's ayahuasca experience, which is a lot to be said for sure. So please listen to that and give us your feedback as usual. Just email us at info@londonreal.tv. This week we have Dr. Rachel Armstrong. She's at the University of Greenwich, and her specialty is living biology and architecture. And what she does is talks about buildings that aren't just, say, carbon neutral, but carbon negative. And she's into engineering systems that aren't biological per se, but kind of nanotechnology that can help, for example, keep Venice from sinking into the lagoon. And she really thinks about projects that are 50, 100 years out. A very intelligent lady, and someone that we really need out there doing these kinds of research. She's the first one to admit that her ideas won't apply necessarily in the next 5 or 10 years, but she's thinking, a long time from now, next 100 years, 200 years, about what's going to happen. So she's excellent. And then 3 days later, in this same very chair, we have legendary bodybuilder and 6-time Mr. Olympia winner, Britain's own Dorian Yates. And it's just amazing. This man sat down with us and talked about what it took to basically become the world's best and keep that reign for 6 years. And he's very honest about the training he went to, about his steroid use, and also about being forced to retire and how you can go from such highs to such lows and deal with that. And he's just a fascinating man. And just when you thought it was going to be an interesting episode, he starts talking about how he drank ayahuasca and his experiences with DMT. And he's got a lot of really interesting things to say. And this is a really exceptional human being and a man with a lot of character, and something you can learn a lot about. And I'm also really privileged that we got to speak with the 50-year-old Dorian as opposed to, say, the 35-year-old Dorian. I think the maturity really... he just brings a lot to the table. So that's going on. Next week we have Tim Ferriss. I'm not going to even talk about that, or I'll be here all day. As usual, we are sponsored by Alpha Brain. If you want to check out some Alpha Brain, you can go on our website, londonreal.tv. There's a clickable link there. You can go. If you do try some, let us know how you feel about it. I'm really enjoying it lately. If you want, just go to our Facebook group, London Reelers, and tell us if you're feeling it or not. Also, we like from On It Labs the Shroom Tech Sport with the cordyceps mushrooms. A lot of great supplements there for cardio workout, and of course the Hemp Force protein. It's a different way or a non-whey protein way of getting some protein in you. So check those out. And also we are sponsored by Audible, which have great audio books. I am currently listening to Life of Pi, Mastery by Robert Greene, who was one of our guests. And also I am still recommending Arnold Schwarzenegger's autobiography. So if you want a free copy of that and a 30-day trial, you can go to audiblepodcast.com/London Real and sign up for that. So without any further ado, here is Dr. Rachel Armstrong. If you enjoy this show, want to give us some feedback, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook. If you really want to get bonus points, you can just do a quick review for us on iTunes, and obviously your comments are welcomed on YouTube. So until then, enjoy. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. back is Mr. Nick Gabriel, and joining us today is Dr. Rachel Armstrong, who is the co-director of Avatar, love that name, which is the Advanced Virtual and Technological Architectural Research at the University of Greenwich here in London. She's also a 2010 TED Senior TED Fellow, and I could go on and on and on, but I won't.
Smartest woman in the world is, I think, an appropriate moniker.
That could be. You're known for so many things, but the one that always sticks out to me is this concept of living architecture. And I was wondering, I'm sure you hear this all the time, but if you could tell us a bit about that concept.
I'm actually going to start by saying that I'm doing exactly what I wanted to do when I was like 5 years old and digging in the dirt in the backyard in my mum and dad's house. And at the time, it used to feel like the biggest garden in the whole wide world, you know, and recently I've been back there for Christmas and stuff, and it's just a tiny little square of grass, you know, with a little bit of crazy pave, and I just remember that place being so big. But what was so fascinating at the time, you know, I didn't even know what a television set was. I wasn't interested in those kinds of things. It was actually the activity in soil. You know, I'd go into the garden, it was like this magical world. And, you know, within a very small piece of land, you could find centipedes and worms and ants and butterflies and grass. And I was just absolutely fascinated with this. And from a really, really early age, I just wanted to work with that creativity. And so essentially, really what I've done over the years has been to build a pathway that enables me to do that as a living. And essentially what I'm doing in terms of living architecture is literally tapping into the creative forces of the natural world as let's call it a technology, as a direct technology, not as a mediated set of ideas of aesthetics or physical principles, but actually using the stuff that surrounds us to shape our environment. And we've been doing that for a very, very long time. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to take a direct approach, as if we could stick our hands into the soil and actually see what the metabolic power, the chemical power that exists within the everyday stuff around us can actually do.
You said we've been doing that for a long time. What's the first example of humans doing that?
Actually, on Phys.org today, which is a site that I dedicate my time to.
What is it?
Phys.org. So essentially, it's a physics and chemistry update site. And today they were describing the oldest civilization, 7,500 years old, was actually gardening and bringing shells and seaweeds to actually create little crops. And it was a time before we historically think that people started to garden. So essentially, as humans, we've been manipulating our environment as long as documented history reveals.
I guess animals have done that too, as well, right? But to a lesser extent.
Yeah, one of the guys I was talking to recently, his name's Ian. He's a PhD student at Royal Holloway. He's actually working with howler monkeys who design their own highways in the trees, and they have a form of horticulture. So he's working with people on one of the islands in Lake Nicaragua to work with the howler monkeys to create a structure that is compatible both with human life, because the howling monkeys don't come down from the trees, and also with monkey life. So it's a symbiosis.
If that isn't a niche career, I don't know what is, right?
Wow.
That's insane. Wow.
And what are you most well known for? I mean, kind of what concept do people think of when they think of you?
Well, I guess the Future Venice project is the one that has been on TED, I guess. And that's the idea that we could grow an artificial limestone reef underneath the city as a way of sustainably reclaiming it. It's not supposed to be a total solution. Essentially, what it's doing is creating a context for an environmental technology. It's really a stage in which we can start talking about the potential of programmable matter, something that we'd probably call natural computing. Natural computing is a really neat idea. I mean, I think this is the alternative technology to machines. And it's a term that was coined after Alan Turing's interest in the computational power of the natural world. And essentially, it's a whole set of unconventional computing practices that look at the ability of chemistry, for example, to make decisions. And essentially, if chemistry can make decisions, well, what kind of uses can we put that to? So Future Venice became a challenge as a way of thinking, well, if we could actually give Venice the ability to fight in the struggle for survival itself, what could it achieve?
Because it's sinking, right?
It's sinking. It's being drowned. There's it's complex. So there are a number of different factors involved, and so that if you think of any one particular solution, it obviously is going to cause knock-on problems down the way. So essentially, this is addressing one of the problems, which is to literally take the stilettos off Venice because it stands on these wood piles.
So wood piles are driven into the clay and they build on top of. This is Venice in Italy, right by the Adriatic Sea.
That's right. And if we take those stilettos off and we put platform boots on, then it just stops it sinking so fast.
Wow.
Rachel, my main question for you today, which is I'm sure one you asked many times, is you speak of nature having computational power. Do you think that the systems we see and this computational power that we see denotes intelligence? Or do you think it's all just a random...
Oh, it's a very interesting idea. I mean, I think that the idea of intelligence as being separate from matter is one of the things that happens when we think in terms of, Enlightenment thinking. In other words, you think of René Descartes. He was a philosopher who described the physical world or the human body as being separate from an ephemeral substance, a soul, a mind, intelligence. I mean, anything that's not material that we can't measure. And so I think that this idea of whether matter possesses or does not possess this ephemeral thing comes from a traditional modernist Enlightenment way of thinking about the natural world. So in some ways, it obviously depends what you mean by intelligence, but and also there's a risk of anthropomorphizing, because of the current way that we think about the world. So does matter think? Well, matter can make decisions. I mean, so the droplets I work with, you put them in a dish and you add some chemicals, and those droplets can make their way towards those chemicals. It's a very simple physical process. It's now supposed to be a decision if it can make a decision between two different chemicals. But we've not demonstrated that there's anything more sophisticated than a physical reflex. Although you could answer, so some determinists who for example, neo-Darwinists essentially say that everything you do is in your genetic program. So there is no free will. So that in some ways, those people believe we don't make any decisions anyway. So whether a droplet is making a decision about whether to move or not also becomes philosophically quite problematic.
And these are the protocells that you're talking about,
Yeah, that's right. Yes, these are little
just
droplets.
quickly, could you describe what they do for people that don't understand?
Yeah, so protocells, so the definition of protocells is controversial. Okay, so eminent scientists from Los Alamos have coined a term for protocells, which is an artificial cell. In other words, one that has a container, metabolism, and information, and it can self-propagate. I don't use protocell in that context. For me, proto means like before or primary, cell, obviously a cell. So I think of them as being the things that happen before we have a proper biological cell. And so these smart droplets, they're not alive because they don't possess any DNA. They haven't really got a centralized program that we tend to associate with biology or life. And yet they have this general natural computing ability that allows them to work in very lifelike ways. So they can move around their environment, they can sense it, they can work with other little droplets or protocells, and they can even make substances. So you can actually get very complex interactions out of very simple things that are literally just made of oil, water, and alkali. So you've really got about 3 or 4 different substances involved. So they're incredibly simple. They also don't occur naturally, although it is said, and the origins of life theories propose that these kinds of agents were around in the black ventas in the deep sea, in the abyss, and the intense heat complexifies molecules, And so it produces the fats, and of course they also have alkali. And so the fat and the alkali makes a kind of soap, but this is essentially the molecular relationship that's driving all this. Essentially, they don't need external energy like a machine does. They actually have an internal energy source, which is their chemistry.
Were these precursors to single-celled organisms, or?
I think scientifically we would never say that, but they are essentially a model system that starts showing us just how dynamic and complex chemical interactions can be.
You're always specific to say that this does not have DNA and this is not biology. Is that because that's not your field? You want to just focus on something that's not quote-unquote living? Or is that something you're open-minded to if it can be a solution to, say, saving Venice?
Well, I think... I
That's
don't think
a blackballed question, Ryan.
Well, I don't think we actually need it to be biological. I mean, so biology has we have a very particular and culturally and scientifically defined idea of what life is. I mean, so the ones that they're using at Los Alamos, for example, is based on this chemiton model, which is invented by a Hungarian called Tibor Ganti. And essentially he said, you need a metabolism, you need a container, and you need some information for it to be capable of being a life. And biology is actually much more complex than that. I mean, that chemiton model is really like the simplest possible set of rules that you could have to produce a living thing. And biology is way, way, way more complex than that. It's got DNA, it's got protein factories, it's got regulatory mechanisms, it can reproduce. So for something to be biological, I mean, there are obviously advantages. So things like being able to make more of itself is something that biology does well. But in terms of a technology, do you really need something that's that complex? Do you actually really want something that's going to self-replicate, or do you actually want
mutate?
Or mutate, or do you want actually something that's just simple enough for you to be able to guide its movement just by feeding it? By taking away some resources or just adding more of the agents. So in some ways that these protocells exist between what we might think of as being synthetic biology, the design and engineering of things that are already alive, and that we can shape through technology. And actually exist between, something like setting concrete. Setting concrete is fascinating. It's like a chemical garden. Until it sets and becomes a geometric blob. It's full of wriggling tubes that crawl over each other and knit together.
I didn't know that.
It's a fascinating...
Concrete itself.
Concrete is
really?
fascinating until it sets. The moment it sets, it just turns into these densely packed crystals. But until that point, it's squirming around like worms. So essentially, these protocells exist somewhere in between, squirming tubes and a biological system, and much more towards the squirming tubes than the biology.
That's interesting.
Wow. You talk about these people talk about carbon neutral all the time, carbon neutral, and I know you've talked about buildings being carbon negative, which is quite a crazy concept, but your research is really popular these days because people want to hear these ideas. I would guess 30 years ago it wouldn't be as popular. And I was just wondering how you're finding that people are relating to your research these days.
I think with the whole environmental movement, I think environmentalism gave us sustainability, and sustainability doesn't really come from environmentalism, it comes from industry. And I think that the challenge that environmentalists have is that if you look at the biggest advocates of sustainability, they're not people who really care about plants and trees and grass and, resource-based economies. They're industrialists.
People who want to keep the capitalist model turning with enough resources to fuel the machine.
That's right. So when you've got big construction industries saying that they're sustainable, and when just about every advertising agency and every business model has the word sustainability somewhere in its first sentence, then you start to realize that what we've actually done is we've mechanized nature. So in other words, we do the thing that Martin Heidegger hated, which was we turned nature into a standing resource. We've turned it into a product that we can consume. And by doing that, we're just feeding an industrial machine. Now, we may be more efficient at the feeding. We may have developed some different aesthetics, but we're not changing the fundamental paradigm that's underpinning human development. In other words,
It's a parasitic relationship with nature.
well, we're damaging it. In some ways, a parasite has a great interest in not damaging its host.
Of course.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So essentially, our paradigms, even if we're on the slow route rather than the fast route towards environmental destruction, sustainability still feeds into the modernist idea. I mean, that the ideas that machines are less damaging to the environment rather than they actually enrich qualities like fertility. I mean, the soils in a city are incredibly poor. They don't have they have very few bacteria in them. If you dug something into the soil, say for example, when I was 5, I dug my dad's master keys down into the soil. Okay, and I believed I would come up with a key tree. My dad whooped my ass, and we never found the keys again, and I was disappointed not to see a little tree growing with keys all over it. But I actually realised, years later, that was actually right. Those keys would have been denatured by the soil, the organisms in the soil. They'd have been eaten by my friends, the worms and the beetles, and they would have been sucked up as salts by the grass. And and some little germinating tree bean would have taken roots, and is now probably the key tree that I was looking for. Mm-hmm. But if you did that in the city and dug a little hole and put your keys in them, and your dad would whoop your ass, you'd probably find them again, and they'd be very untouched because the soil is not very rich in bacteria. So we've actually reduced the fertility of the soil that we build our buildings on, and in some ways we've got a completely different value system. We're just valuing geometry, horizontal geometry. Not the creative power that's a resource there that can, say, for example, transform our waste. That can, produce green plants that will enrich the oxygen and fix, dirty particles that are floating around in the atmosphere.
You say horizontal geometry, you mean like the rainforest is over here and this is over here?
I mean that when we build a building, we value it in terms of its square footage.
Okay, not the whole system.
No, we're not valuing it for the amount of sunlight hitting it. We're not, or for its creative potential, other than in terms of a resource that we can sell as a square of geometry that we put a bit of concrete on and kill it.
Rachel, I watched a movie the other day, Back to the Future 2, and I was really disappointed because we've reached it's set in 2015 or maybe 2013, and we've pretty much reached that era, and there's no flying cars and there's no hoverboards and a bunch of things that are depicted in there. And I got to thinking, your work, it's quite futuristic. The idea of a living building that can be carbon negative, as Brian mentioned, or can repair itself, or use these paradigms that are found in nature. How realistic is the first question, and secondly, how far away are we from things like that? When will the day come where we'll find these structures in our cities? And do you think that day will ever come?
These structures already exist. For example, in societies where there is a very fertile landscape, so the living trees of Cherrapunji, the native people there knit. I mean, it's a practice that's handed down between generations. They knit together these rope bridges from living roots that can span gullies that are 30 meters across. And when the monsoons come and there's torrential water, the trees stay standing, whereas a mechanistic bridge wouldn't. What needs to change, I think, is the hardest thing, is our mindset. We're living in an urban condition, and the unmediated properties of biology are not suited to the lifestyle that we expect. Also, we're very comfortable with machines, and we're comfortable with them right now because we're still not really suffering from the damage of a monoculture of technology. I mean, and essentially that's my beef. It's not, I don't really have a fundamental problem with machines, except that it's the only thing that we can do. And we really need to expand our technological skill set. So what do we need to do that? I think, first of all, we need to think differently. I think that these natural computers are a 21st century technology. So for the last 300 years, we've been developing a technology, one technology which is based on machines. Okay, we've got a lot of species of them, but essentially they all eat the same thing. They all eat the fossil fuels. They all work in a particular way, and they all produce the same kind of poisons. And that's beginning to tell, particularly as we've amplified the damage through industrial processes. So natural computing essentially requires, first of all, a different way of thinking, and it requires a different infrastructure. But that's interesting because it's the same infrastructure that we share. So let's call them elemental infrastructures. So we need environments that are rich with water, air, heat, and earth, because those are the conditions in which chemistry and biology thrive. And then after these infrastructures, then we need to start thinking about which systems we can program using those kinds of things. So, for example, future Venice works because Venice is situated in water. If it didn't have a watery infrastructure, if we did it in Vienna, it would be a different challenge altogether, because we'd have to develop almost like a tree-like water system to go through the building walls to try and capture water, and then create a condition in which these droplets can start to deposit materials. So there are a number of different things that we need to do in order to develop these technologies, but I don't think that we need to do it in huge expanses of city, and I think you could do it as details of buildings, small. I think the algae technology is starting to talk about those kinds of environments. My concern with it is that it will be swallowed up as a soft component within machine thinking, so that you're just going to flog an algae to death just because you're looking at its, the efficiency of it producing a fuel. Rather than actually engaging with it to do all kinds of different things, maybe like filter out light rays, during very bright times during the day, or maybe it could dance to the music on your iPod, because these are little particles that exist within water.
Brian, as the resident capitalist industrialist, what are your thoughts?
Scientist. I'm worried about Venice, to be honest, because I think Nick has a good point. I think these are fantastic ideas, and I'm sure they have some practicality, but in 50 years or 100 years, Venice will be in worse shape. And
That's
also
soon, huh?
knowing the bureaucracy of the Italian government to allow them to touch such a sacred site. These are great ideas, but will they ever be practiced?
I think I think that is really to do with changing our mindset. So for example, the Italian government have got the Moses Gates right now. The concern with the Moses Gates, essentially I think of them as being giant robotic king canutes, 78 of them, to hold back the tide.
This is a lot like the barrier on the Thames, that kind of theory.
That's right, yes.
Right, so it's like the plan to block off the lagoon when the flooding comes.
Separate it from the Adriatic Sea.
Right,
and
which puts all sorts of bells and whistles off for environmentalists.
There's, did one of our guests mention this? There was some Dutch guy who had an alien encounter, and this alien race said where they come from, their religion is efficiency. And I'm just thinking you would do very well on that planet if you're not already from that planet, because that's nature, right? Nature is the most efficient thing that we know.
I think efficiency is a very odd way to judge nature. Nature works has a different set of principles. So I think the unique things that machines don't do. So I think efficiency is a very mechanical way of thinking about the way that things work. I'd say robustness, flexibility, adaptability, the qualities that we really can't measure very well. So for example, the little droplets that I work with, you can give them all kinds of assaults and they'll come back, they'll reassemble. That they are capable of surprising you. When these ecological technologies, when these natural computers reach tipping points, and we don't understand the process, because essentially what we've got is a system that works in parallel, but it's coupled to its delivery system. So unlike say for example, a computer, which needs a translator for whatever computation is going on to then turn it into a material thing, in a natural computer, the information and the output are coupled. And so essentially you can see these droplets all of a sudden undergoing some kind of change because they've reached a tipping point in the system. And that's something that we'll need to study a lot more.
Interesting.
But in terms of the practicality, I think it's going to depend on people's general value systems. I mean, how important does the idea of working with environmental conditions how important does that become in over the next century? How successful are the Moses Gates going to be?
Can you talk more about the Moses Gates and what's going on? And
yeah, I mean, so they should open in 2014. That's what I've heard.
oh, they're building them.
Oh yeah,
Oh, wow,
you
I
can
didn't
see
know
the
that.
sites now. You can see these. I mean, it looks like Finn McCool and Ben and Donna have just had another great big fight. They're the two, the Irish and Scottish giants that had, legend says, had the big, bust up over, between the Irish Sea and Scotland, and they created the Giants Causeway. So essentially, it looks like these guys have been holidaying in Venice. They've got these great big constructions and the great big machines, and you're starting to see all these, materials being deposited in the lagoon. So they're due for opening in 2014, and I think it's actually going to be exciting and phenomenal.
Okay.
But obviously, environmentally, the idea of backlogging the outflow of the entire Po Delta, which is the river that feeds the region of Venice, is going to create some difficulties in the lagoon ecology. Mm-hmm. Now, the lagoon ecology may be robust enough to survive that kind of assault, or it may scream and we may see a lot of loss of ecological systems. Mm-hmm. And actually the marine wildlife around the Po Delta is actually very rich. Venice has got a very rich marine ecology. It's actually got its own species of nasty little mosquito called the tiger mosquito. If you ever come across one of those, run. They'll get through your leather jacket.
Never
Horrible.
seen one of those.
Oh no, you
kind of
don't. They sneak up on you and
It's kind
sit
of
in your
swampy over there. You mentioned resource-based economy earlier, and we've had Jacques Fresco sitting in that seat, and we had a good discussion about him, and tons of our fans wanted to know what you think of the Venus project, because it doesn't sound like it's exactly what you're talking about, but they do build their structures to kind of interact with the environment. So what are your thoughts?
I mean, I agree with the value system of a resource-based economy. Essentially, where I differ is that I wouldn't use a modernist approach. And so essentially, the Venus project, in terms of its aesthetics and its dedication to mechanical technologies, is essentially a modernist idea. And so, the paradigm that I work with comes from ecological technologies, natural computing. It doesn't really depend on machines. It's actually much more about shaping the material environment that we're in by actually using the computational power, the power of the soil as the technology that creates the desired effects.
Right, Rachel. Let's say your ideas become generally accepted and they influence the next generation of architecture and city planning. How would you describe the ideal, perfect city according to your views in 200 years' time? What would it look like? How would it work?
It wouldn't be an aesthetic, okay? But I imagine the idea of soft cities. In other words, the city becomes a site for the production of soil, which increases the fertility of the land. One of the big problems we're going to have is, the ability to feed people. Mm-hmm. And if you think about the amount of waste that we produce within cities, we're just flushing it down into the oceans and creating all kinds of poisons. But what if our actual homes could produce a composting system within the walls? You wouldn't have to see it, we wouldn't have to live in it. We actually all make a product that is a kind of rich soil, because we have our own bacteria and fungi that we never really see, but they live they live alongside us. They're doing their thing. They're producing heat from all their metabolism, so maybe they could be doing underfloor heating. You'd control that by ventilating the air underneath the floor. So if you produce a lot of oxygen, they produce a lot of heat. If you shut off the oxygen and let them simmer, then it reduces the heat. So the other thing is, I think that with these, if we can actually transform rather than just consume, we're starting to become producers rather than consumers. So if every home is actually producing something rather than just simply being a site of consumption, we're actually starting to, I guess, reclaim a kind of economics. And I don't mean a centralized economics. I think, again, in terms of technologies, I like to see a diversity of approaches. So I'm not against machines. I'm not against modernism. I'm trying to find, an alternative paradigm that can help us solve problems in different ways where it's appropriate. But I think a diversity of forms of economies, so that whether that's a knowledge economy, whether it's actually being able to produce things locally. So maybe somebody is, developing a community garden, and that if you bring your soil along, you've got this opportunity to either grow plants or maybe it's something that you can sell in other ways. But essentially, the idea is to produce. And also enriching the fertility of the planet. I mean, there's a fantastic book, if you've not read it, it's William Bryant Logan's Dirt. I mean, it sounds like it should be a really dull read, but it's absolutely fantastic. It's poetry and
It's
science.
similar type topics he's talking about.
And he's much more of a traditional environmentalist than I am. I mean, I really like my technology. It's just a very particular kind. And I guess his technology is soil itself. And so, he talks about, the transformative properties of soil. I mean, he actually comes up with quite a lot of biblical references. One is a really beautiful one about the burning bush. And he's asking, why did God send a burning bush? And as he comes to the conclusion that actually he's telling him about metabolism, something that is burned but is not consumed by the burning.
Or Moses was just really fucking high.
Maybe. I drank some ayahuasca beforehand. You talk about technology, and everyone, and some of our fans asked you what you thought about the singularity, which can be described in a lot of ways, but from what I understand, it's kind of like us kind of merging with technology, I guess, in the future. I was wondering if you could describe singularity and how you feel about it.
Yeah, I think singularity is almost the logical conclusion of Cartesian thinking. So if you extract the soul and all the ephemeral bits, you're left with a mechanical geometric thing.
Of us, you mean?
Of us. And essentially, it's almost like a wish fulfillment. Therefore, the perfect body is one that is effectively mechanical. So it was interesting. I mean, I saw Ray Kurzweil's, the Singularity is Near, the premiere in London, which was at the Science Museum, and it was a very touching film. But you can't help going away for thinking that Ray Kurzweil has a vendetta against death. He's very upset that his father passed away, and the idea of becoming more machine-like almost seems like an emotional defense against the decay of the flesh, and so in some ways it's a kind of denial of being made of biological matter.
God damn, how smart is this lady, man? Wow.
But I mean, I think it's just a model of a way of thinking that's being literalized through the idea that we can upload our bodies, escape our souls somehow or other. I mean, I believe that material and the ephemeral are entangled. You can't extract one and just leave the other. And I mean, that's the image of Frankenstein. That's what Mary Shelley was saying. You can't just take a soul out, stitch your body together, put a great big electrical current. You can call it mind, you can call it, soul, whatever. Charge it up and off it goes. We end up, thinking like necromongers. We kill everything, and then we think we're really great because we animate it again with a dirty, great big charge of electricity. Whoa, look at that. But these metals that are around us. So Ruskin was really interested in how beautiful metals were before they were processed into pig iron. He talks about the greens and the browns of iron that he sees in oxides, in the landscape. And of course, Ruskin is not only a hopeless romantic, but he's also very anti in industry. But he has a point about the complexity of the structures that we then reduce through this mechanical process. I mean, and they think it's very. We need to be aware of the actual philosophy that we're subscribing to. And so for me, the singularity is a kind of philosophy. It's not really well critiqued. There aren't people that are critiquing the singularity, in a very critical cultural way. It's either something you believe in or you don't.
I mean, the singularity could be viewed in another way. You could say that instead of us fusing with technology at some point in the distant future, or technology becoming self-aware, which is another definition of it, we might actually fuse with nature again, or be able to incorporate our lifestyles and our cities back into the natural world. I mean, that might be a nicer way to look at the singularity.
I think there are all kinds of different singularities. Ray Kurzweil's made a particular one very popular. I mean, and essentially the singularity is the idea. I mean, so again, it comes, the actual idea of a singularity comes from a Cartesian way of thinking, which is it's deterministic. In other words, so because we see ourselves as geometry, we can describe ourselves mathematically. We call these mathematical principles natural law. We use those to predict a point in the future, okay? And when we can't see beyond that extrapolation, we say that's a singularity because we can't, our calculation breaks down. Therefore, anything can happen. So the alternative to that is actually using systems theory. This is, where mathematics starts to surprise you with paradoxes and things like that. And so essentially, the element of surprise is inherent to your encounters. In some ways, there's a fantastic physicist. I wish I'd met him whilst he was alive. Ilya Prigogine. If you've not,
chaos theory.
So he says that time is actually a creative force. It's not just this, not an elemental quality. It's actually a creative force that stops things from being reversible. It's the irreversibility of things that actually is where creative opportunities lie. But, so there's a downside in that, is you don't know what's going to happen in the future. The upside is that you're actually empowered because you can actually co-construct your future by bringing things together. You're actually empowered to do that, and it's a creative process. So that's the trade-off. So singularity says these things are going to happen, they're already fixed, doesn't matter what you do, it's going to happen anyway. I prefer the other approach, coming from a different set of mathematics and a different view of what the future is. And I don't really believe in a future. I kind of believe in an unevenly distributed present, that you can, reappropriate resources and try and create opportunities that don't exist in places because you have a desire to do something new. You may not know exactly what it is, but actually attempting that impossible, attempting the unknown, is actually a creative process. And again, I think it's a different way of thinking for 21st century, science, technology, culture. And I think what we really need to find ways of sharing stories that are easy to understand about these things, because we're really going to need to believe in each other and to be able to deal with the unknown in this coming century. When we've got things like Katrina and Sandy and the Japanese tsunamis, in a secular world, how do we deal with that uncertainty? Because that's not an easy thing.
There are certain individuals who believe, from an environmental point of view, that we have already crossed the Rubicon and that ecological disaster is imminent. We can't even reverse the process even if we wanted to. What are your thoughts on that?
We've had a number of ecological disasters throughout the planet. Again, PhysOrg was identifying the oldest life forms as existing about 3.5 billion years ago. That's Shark Bay, Australia. I really want to go there. And I'm going to make sure I wear, because I think that the rocks are actually very rough. So I'm going to make sure I wear flip-flops when I do that. But so these, life has been extinguished many times. I mean, and someone like Paul Davies, who's a physicist, says that right at the origins of life, the meteor bombardment, killed off life many, many, many times. Now, eventually it gets to a threshold where the universe stopped bombarding the hell out of planet Earth, and life. It's got this thing about it. It wants to survive. Now, whether who was it? It was E.O. Wilson, around about the 1970s, is saying, we're in the age of this, the sixth great extinction. Bad news is it's happening. Good news is 10 million years it'll be over. So what survives after 10 million years? Whether that's something that's going to be calling itself human and yet may, superficially look very different from ourselves today, or whether humans are no longer there. I mean, I'm not fatalistic about it. I just think that, we are in a period of change. We need to deal with it. I don't think we can stop it from happening. And that's why I think that we need a variety of strategies, not just the the same old thinking processes and the same technologies, to keep on flogging a planet that's really suffering at the moment.
I think we should get over our own extinction possibility.
Well,
Let it go, Nick.
But I mean, I want us to survive too, and I think there's also a false dichotomy between environmentalism and humanism. I think if you do get a collapse of technology with nature, where the two things are very similar, then the human interest and the planetary interest are very much entangled. So I think at the moment they're different sets of politics. But again, I'd like to. I'd like to see ideas, working, together with ideas of new technologies that are inherently. I guess the word I'm using, is fertile. We want stuff that's life promoting. We want stuff that's regenerative. We need stuff like soil to reclaim some of the. I guess the scattering of resources that we've and the kind of negative transformations that we've made over the last certainly 150 years.
It's nice. I like to hear this optimism. We had a lot of doom and gloom people here, so I call it optimism. I mean, speaking of optimism, if you look out to the next 10 years or 20 years, what are you optimistic about, and what concerns you? Just that simply.
I think the thing that concerns me most is people. The hardest thing to do is to change the way that we think. The optimism I have is in the kids. I don't mean that flippantly. I've been working with some young folks, do it over the internet with a couple of young American boys.
Are these 20s or teens?
No, teens.
They get
teens.
younger every
They're
year.
fantastic. And the thing is that, we get these questions, you're sitting on a panel and someone says, so how are we going to do this change? And I think, our peer group is over, and we're going to still do the same things. But and we're not going to change even if we have a massive, great disaster. We're still going to do the same things because that's what we know. But what we will get are the next generations that are going to go, oh my God, you have a crazy value system. Your technologies suck. And we're going to do things differently. We're not going to live in an age of austerity. Hang it. We're going to actually, reclaim our lives. I think that the almost like the patronising, lines that are being sold to young people by, well-meaning politicians and environmentalists that they've got to stop almost breathing before they can deserve a future. I think that's what's going to, really ignite change. Young people today have to live a life, and it needs to be enriched, it needs to be creative, it needs to be fulfilling. They need to believe in it. And I don't think that they can believe in this system, particularly as we're so reluctant to really change anything about it. I mean, currently, right now, the biggest thing that governments is thinking, we've got to save business. It's like, all our cities, the future of our cities has been handed over to goddamn business. I mean, IBM's Smarter Planet, Hewlett-Packard's notion of an Internet of Things. I mean, where's the visionary thinking? Where's the leadership that's coming from government? If we're going to hand over the future of the planet to business, we are definitely doomed. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, because obviously businesses are a particular kind of thing and they need to make money. But I think that we really need to find different ways of imagining and developing futures for ourselves. And one of the things I'm doing, I tend to engage in impossible projects projects that right now seem like a crazy idea and I'm never going to do it. And in some ways, the projects that I'm working on, I'll probably not live to see whether I was right or wrong. So that's fine by me, but I'm interested in the adventure. And so other than the Future Venice project, again, like you say, it is going to be a challenge. It's going to depend on an awful lot of contingencies. What the people of Italy think, whether or not the Moses Gates are a big success, whether or not Tiatini et al. Is an Italian group of researchers that are thinking of reinflating Venice's aquifers to raise the city anthropogenically over a period of 10 years. If that happens, they'll probably need the protocell technology because actually it could coat the wooden posts and stop them rotting when they're exposed to the air. And that would be a big problem if that goes ahead. So there are a lot of contingencies. I don't think it's a complete, no, this is never going to happen. And I don't think it's, oh yeah, it's definitely going to happen. But essentially it's a resource. So the other project that I'm working on is called Persephone. And this is part of the Icarus Interstellar Group's work with the DARPA-funded 100-year Starship project. Now, that is an initiative.
What is that?
I'm so glad I'm sober.
So that is an initiative to construct a crewed interstellar ship in 100 years. And so Persephone is the design
Is there such a thing as a crewed interstellar ship?
Yeah, crewed, C-R-E-W-E-D.
Crude.
Okay.
Oh,
Oh, okay. All right.
Manned.
man. Okay.
I see.
Or
Okay.
woman.
Yeah, manned and womaned.
Right.
So within 100 years. And so Persephone is about designing a natural computer, in other words, another form of nature, to support the interstellar crew in the 100-year Starship project.
Because they couldn't bring supplies with them. It would have to be something that lives.
Well, essentially, you'd need something that would respond to the changes within the. Essentially, it's a biosphere, but learning lessons from things like Biosphere 2, which pretty much got swallowed by cockroaches and internal difficulties.
This was in Arizona.
That's
that
right.
biosphere.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So just trying to rethink a strategy, whereupon everything is recycled, and not trying to work with, say, for example, plants, but actually what can we actually grow from the chemical components. How do we start thinking about that? What infrastructures do we need? What is the kind of conditions in which such a thing may be possible? Again, I don't know how we're going to do it, but I'm working with an incredible group of technologists, some of whom work with natural computing, so they work with chemical computing, they work with slime molds, they work with algae, they work with traditional engineering technologies, but essentially it's a mashup. And it's a kind of black sky thinking beyond what the market actually wants, and thinking about what can be possible if we stretch our imaginations and actually just start to play with ideas and have fun about it. I think one of the problems with the way that research is funded and the way that new ideas come about tends to be a pot of money, like X prize money. So you have to design the spacecraft that does these particular things. So everybody goes running for a very particular kind of output. And so the output's already set before you even engage in the adventure. And so I guess, what I like to do in places like Persephone is bring people together who are very exciting in terms of the way that they think. So it's designers as well as technologists. So we have people like Kurt van Mensvoort, who works with something called Next Nature. He's Dutch. The Dutch are kind of got crazy ideas. I love the Dutch. So those kinds of ideas brought together with technologists who are wondering what the hell to do with these incredible, strange computers, put them all together in a room and something happens. You may not know exactly what it is. You've got a few principles that you want to test out. And essentially those kinds of innovation forums, I don't like the word innovation, but I mean, they're it's just having fun really with ideas and making
ideas.
stuff.
So you like the big ideas, the one that you'll never actually see realized.
Maybe.
Okay. Or maybe.
Maybe I will see them realised. I mean, and the thing is, I take it seriously because I think it's serious. But that doesn't stop me really enjoying what I want to do because, like I say, I'm doing what I wanted to do when I'm 5.
What's a typical week for you? That's what I want to know. I mean, I can't tell if you're in the lab or if you're not, or if you're at a TED Talk, because let's be honest, I think you talking is probably just as important as you researching it, isn't it?
Yeah, so one of the most important things I do is actually build teams of people that can work together. And it's really important to get the right kind of person and build proper relationships with people, not just say, oh, I've got money here and you'll do this, but actually get people excited about trying out new ideas. And in some ways, I create an environment where people can play without losing reputations, because it's an experiment. All of these things are experiments. We don't know what the outcomes are, and we produce pictures and models and tell stories, have ideas, and do it again. And so essentially community building is a big thing. So I'll spend a good part of my week making sure that I'm communicating, writing, raising money for things, and just making sure that everybody's still on board and understand where we are at certain points in different projects. Another part of the week I'll spend teaching. So I have students at the School of Architecture, Design and Construction at the University of Greenwich, and I really enjoy that. Because again, the projects that we ask the students to engage in are all the philosophy of architecture. So we ask them to go beyond, the production of a geometric shape and its procurement, and actually start thinking about, other ideas to do with, the kinds of materials that you'd use, the kinds of experiences that you'd have, the kinds of clients who might be interested in these kinds of things. So you get, engagement with poetry, like, Keats in Venice, or giant cathedrals that play with light and astrophysics. These kinds of ideas become embodied in the projects, simply because we want to equip the students with the tools for thinking when they come across something new in their practice. It may seem indulgent from the outside world. Why are you doing these extreme thought experiments? But essentially, if you don't train the thought muscles, you come across a project and you simply won't know how to deal with it, one. And secondly, you won't really use new technologies appropriately. And particularly for young architects, if Moore's law stays true and we have these, exponential increases in the power of mechanical technologies and digital technologies, then, how do they start to understand what this actually means for their practice? So that's why we do that. And then the rest of my week I'll probably spend writing, and I'll take about 3 or 4 periods a year of 2 to 3 weeks working in a lab in Denmark with my chemistry supervisor, Martin Hanzuk, who designed a lot of these smart droplet systems, or going to do field work in Venice, working along the canals and documenting the actual natural mineralization that's going on in the canals there. So if you actually walk along the canals, you'll see that the biology is already doing this process. And so the idea for the droplets or the protocells is that they coordinate with the marine environment, so they co-construct an architecture that is relevant to the organisms and the city inhabitants. It's varied.
So you like your lab work and your field work?
I love
like.
it. I love the hands-on. I start starving for hands-on when I do too much.
That's good. That gives you street cred, doesn't it?
It's where I think it's where you actually, you delve into a different world. I completely lose myself in experiments. You will not see me whilst I'm on the microscope at the University of Southern Denmark. I'm sure I cheese a lot of people off in the lab because I'm there, I'm camped out by the lab. And I'll be there till 4 o'clock in the morning. I'll be back at 8 o'clock in the morning. It doesn't matter whether there's been a snowstorm with, 1.5 meters of snow outside, I'm back.
You want to see what's growing?
God, yeah.
Okay. That's awesome. I don't know what to say much more there. While we hit these organizations, the last one I wanted to ask, people asked what you thought of the Zeitgeist movement. And I know when you first got here, we were talking about movements and how you like and dislike the whole concept of a movement. And so I just wonder what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I guess I'm somebody who's, I like free, independent thinking. And for me, the thing I resist is dogmas. So whether that's a scientific dogma that says that, creative opportunities and the incorporation of arts into the development of technology is a nonsense because it doesn't fit their pre-constructed ideas about the world. So whether that's a scientific environment or whether it's even an environmental movement that says things can only be done one way. Mm-hmm. I'm up for everybody's creative empowerment. I'm as willing as anybody to join in with a good idea. In our sessions where we get excited about materials and strange things going on. If somebody has a great idea, we're all in. And so it's about pursuing things that you have a shared common interest. And I think you need to be very flexible about what a good idea is, and not just stick to a pre-prescribed pathway, because I think that's when you start losing touch with actually what is going on around you.
So when you identify yourself, I'm a zeitgeister, do you think you shut down yourself from other ideas?
If it allows you to think beyond a certain, I mean, if it means that you have a certain set of principles that are very flexible and can respond to changing sets of circumstances, then, I mean, everybody has a kind of internal set of principles, whether it's your ethics and morals or, cultural conditions. I mean, everybody has a set of rules, but they really need to be flexible. And if they're not flexible, they start to constrain and damage your way of thinking.
That's
you start to
amazing.
end up with all kinds of obstacles that aren't really necessary.
It seems to me, Brian, that a large part of Rachel's success is cultivating open-mindedness, and I think that's something that I know you and I are trying to do. I don't know how well we're succeeding, but I know we're trying to do that. It's really nice to see that. I mean, you've mentioned it and referenced it so many times in this discussion. It's like,
I think she might have a point about, our generation, depending on how old you are at this table, that, maybe to a certain extent, we aren't capable of changing our minds because we've been flooded all of our lives with all of this information that it's hard for us to conceive new ideas. And maybe it is the, as Whitney Houston would say, I believe the children are our future. But, you know what
you
I
should
mean?
sing more in the show. It's amazing.
But maybe it will change, need that whole younger generation to step up, just as we said to our older generation and said, what are you doing? You guys are acting like idiots. Stop doing this stuff.
But I mean, I think one of the things that we're afraid of what we're going to lose. I mean, I think, as you get older, there are all these things that you cling to, which either give you status, they give you security, they give you, some kind of social recognition. And you think, well, hang on, I've got here by doing these particular things, and oh my God, now I'm going to do something completely different. That's not an easy thing to do.
Well, again, comes back like on a hippie spiritual level. It's a subjugation of the ego, right? It's like being able to identify why you're holding on to things. I mean, a lot of people can't even do that.
Well, you see, I think that's what the 21st century kids are going to be doing. I mean, because, there is no job security. There is no job for life. There are no deterministic pathways anymore. Every, survival will depend on your flexibility, not just in terms of, your physical ability to survive in an environment, but also to think differently. Technologies are going to change all the time. The environment is going to change even faster. And how to stay optimistic. And optimism really is the most important thing, because it means that you're setting yourself goals and you're going for it. I mean, if someone said asteroid heading the way to Earth, I'd be going, right, let's build Persephone, and we'd be in the workshop. Who knows whether the asteroid will hit or not, but I'll be building that spaceship.
Have you seen Armageddon with Bruce Willis and Ben Affleck?
No, I don't want to go there.
It's crappy.
Yeah, I gotta it's actually interesting to talk about the austerity, and maybe the austerity is something that's going to facilitate this whole younger generation. And maybe it will be a benefit in getting them to think out of the box, because no longer are these set pathways how you do everything.
Yeah. No, I mean, I must say that I've been kind of curiously surprised how unrebellious, say, the late teens, early 20s are. They seem to, all have businesses by the time they're 13, incredibly responsible, dress sense is immaculate. They could be on any Hollywood show and look
They sound
perfect.
kind of boring.
But when I was a kid, it was punks, and I mean, we looked dreadful. We came back home and our parents went, "Oh my God."
So you're worried that it's a bit too...
Well, in some ways, I'm kind of trying to figure out where conformism comes from, because I feel that there's a degree of conformism.
Too much.
But maybe, yeah.
You might have a point.
You know who would get on like a house on fire with Rachel is Miles Dyer.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
No, we've been lucky to have 20-somethings come on this show with these huge visions, and it just strikes me. I'm like, what? When I was 25, I was doing dumb shit, and I was never thinking about giving back.
Yeah.
That never even came into my mind till the 30s, and so yeah, I'm continually impressed and optimistic.
Well, again, I mean, I'm hoping that this is a reaction to the incredible conformism and I guess stability that was there late 80s all through the 90s. And maybe I mean the guy I was talking to about the howler monkeys and the a co-creation of architectures. I mean, he's 22, so I mean, I'm really excited about what the future holds.
I can tell.
I am too after this conversation.
Yeah, it's nice.
Yeah.
No, it's nice because we get into a lot of doom and gloom and a lot of we're doing the wrong things and big business is crushing us, and it's nice that you can see it even from a big picture. Like, the species have been crushed before, and it might be a new iteration for the future. I don't know. I'm positive about that.
Yeah.
I have to ask you one other thing, because you talk about nature, and obviously a lot of what you do is getting your mind to different levels, and it's something we talk about on the show. But where do you think, if you do at all, that psychedelics come into any play with the human experience, with creativity, with any of this stuff? Or is this taboo if you're someone in the academia?
It's not something that I'm experienced with, let's put it that way. But I understand the doors of perception, and I saw Timothy Leary speak once at the ICA. Yeah,
Wow.
he had a collection of disciples that was a theatre deep around him. I think by that time he was kind of old.
It's interesting because we've had Simon Powell on here, who's the author of the Psilocybin Solution. We've had Graham Hancock, who talks a lot about his ayahuasca experiences. I think both of them work with you on Earth 2.0. And when they went down to the Venus Project, I think, and even a little mention of the whole possibility of psychedelics had Jacques and the crew just shut down completely.
Because they're restricted by their own dogmas.
I don't know. That's what I want to know. Do you think some of these things are restricted by their own dogmas?
I mean, so you're talking about that. Do chemicals change perception? I think.
I mean, we know that.
Yeah.
We know they do, but I'm guessing.
Is there a place for them? Do you think in this whole path and this whole that we're talking about, or is that really a completely different issue in your mind?
I think in some ways it's a different issue. It's not something that I would personally do. But I think people reach creativity in many different ways, and I would not be prescriptive one way or the other. I mean, if it's something that works for people, and obviously, many creatives have experimented with mind-altering substances.
I don't think you need it by any means. But it's interesting though, because like when it comes to ayahuasca and psilocybin, they also seem to give the user, when they use these medicines, like this real in touch sense with nature and the environment. And it almost seems, and since these are naturally occurring substances, it almost seems like this feedback loop.
Yeah, but there are also lots of naturally occurring poisons as well. And so the idea that things are naturally occurring isn't necessarily
I see your point
an endorsement.
But there is but I guess these things do, for some reason, tend to remind humans of a lot of the things that they...
I'd be terrified to see what would happen if Rachel took ayahuasca. I mean, she would probably take over the world. I
know what that means. I've got a couple questions, Rachel, and then we'll wrap up. If you could make a phone call to the 22-year-old Rachel Armstrong, what advice would you give her?
Oh, just keep on going, keep believing in yourself.
Okay.
That's a common one.
That's a common one. And you kind of said it earlier, but what advice do you have to people now listening to this in their teens or in their early 20s? They're thinking about going into academia or not, don't know what to do with their lives. What would you say to them?
Just enjoy the journey of discovery. Nothing's fixed. You can change everything.
That's awesome.
And it sounds like also you just not even think outside the box, but it sounds like you're encouraging people just to just completely... I don't know.
Immerse yourself in something that you really care about, and get really good at it. There is no spare time.
Okay, wow, that's good advice. How do people get a hold of you?
Twitter, at Living Architect.
Living Architect. And what is your history with TED? Will you be giving more talks for TED? TED seems to love you.
I love TED.
How do you? How is that relationship formed? How many TED Talks have you given?
I've given 4 officially. Only one's online.
Only the ones online.
But 2 of them were 3-minute talks on main stage, and one was at the TED Salon recently, which was about the metaphysical chicken, about how we would design a chicken.
Wow. And what's up for you this year and next year?
This year I'm going to be talking at LIFT.
What's that?
LIFT is a technology conference in Geneva, which is in February, and I'll finishing my PhD thesis, which should be number one thing.
So right now you're a physical. Are you a physical doctor? That's
I'm a medical doctor.
Medical doctor.
Oh, wow, I didn't even know that.
Yeah, in her spare time. And so now you want to get the PhD.
My thesis will be in architecture.
Okay, in architecture.
Yeah, so I also hope this year to develop a couple of ideas about ecological human, about the infrastructure, the kind of the philosophy of people in the 21st century that are not based on machines, but are based on these ecologies of dynamic chemistries. So essentially, we're our bacteria, we're our environment. A plant is as much of our breathing system as our lungs are. So how do we actually start to imagine that? And what does that mean then? How do we then think about ourselves and our world if our body changes the way that it relates to the environment and the way we think about it?
It's an interesting way. It seems to me that Rachel thinks about things, because so many people that invent things are like, okay, we got to build something that does this. We got to build something that does this. And with you, it's almost like you're tying one hand behind the back, because you can't build anything. You kind of have to simulate an environment and let it kind of build itself.
Yes, and I think the first thing to build is, one, the integrity of the ideas. So because what happens is that, I think for me, storytelling, using these different ideas is really key. And then that binds a community. And really for me, I'm interested in people in their teens and 20s. People my age, they're doing their thing. I'm happy with
over
that.
Them, over the hill.
But to actually try and equip young people with tool set for thinking as an alternative strategy. I want to see what happens with that. I'd like to see how they run with that. But to actually develop a very clear set of ideas and tools and possibilities, and literally open up the future. Not just bring it down to this set of austere conditions that are just going to evolve more machines.
Wow. What do you do for fun?
This is fun.
Okay. Yeah. Enough said. I don't know what else to say. Thank you so much for coming in. You really, I felt like we were all on some kind of, what's the name of that ship going out to outer space?
Oh, the 100-year starship.
Yeah, I felt like we were all on a starship there.
Honestly, Rachel, you are without question the most intelligent woman I've ever interacted with.
What happened to person? Why do you have to qualify it that way?
No, that was just absolutely phenomenal. I feel like I'm a slightly smarter or slightly less stupid monkey after having spent an hour chatting to her.
We've got to introduce you to some howler monkeys.
I don't know if that was just the best backhanded compliment. I don't know that. Not sure. No, that was awesome. Thanks so much for coming on. I get a much better feel for you with an hour. It's great to see you on TED, but it's only 7 minutes or 9 minutes or 3 minutes. It's hard. So, no, thank you so much. I think everyone's going to love this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a huge amount of fun.
All right. Well, until then.
It's about the journey.
All right. Thank you both.
Welcome to London.
And the energy became very dark. So there was a thick negative energy in that room.
You remember this?
Yes, I remember that. I left it out of it. It was before. It was around the time of the infinite mental loop I'd entered into.
Okay.
And I can't remember.